He was renovating the house after the old man's death, thinking it was a normal job. But under the floor, he found something that the owner had hidden all his life. See what he found under the old boards, and why this secret was never meant to be revealed. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The road that led to the old property was narrow, uneven, and lined with the kind of trees that looked as if they had stopped growing decades ago. Their crooked branches hung over the lane, clutching at the mist that rolled down from the hills like tired ghosts returning home. Daniel Hayes gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his old pickup rattling beneath him, the bed loaded with planks, tools, and an assortment of buckets and ropes that clanged at every bump. It was late afternoon when he finally saw the house, a faded silhouette standing apart from the rest of the town, surrounded by an overgrown yard where nature had started reclaiming what people had abandoned long ago. He pulled into the gravel drive and killed the engine. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the soft ticking of metal cooling under the hood and the distant rush of a nearby creek. Daniel stepped out, stretching his stiff back, and took in the place that would be his workspace for the next few days. It wasn't the worst house he had ever worked on, but it had the look of one that had been loved once, then left to fend for itself. Paint had peeled from the siding, shutters hung crooked, and ivy crept up the porch columns like green veins feeding an aging heart. The door opened before he reached it. A woman stepped out a little younger than him, though her posture carried the careful stillness of someone who had learned to move through grief quietly. Her name was Maylin Wood. She greeted him politely, with the kind of distant courtesy that belonged to people who didn't invite strangers easily into their space. "I really appreciate you coming out here," she said, smoothing the sleeves of her sweater. "It's an old house. My grandfather built most of it himself, but I think something's wrong with the hallway floor. It's colder than the rest of the place. Always has been. He said never to fix it, but—" She trailed off, glancing past him toward the truck. Daniel nodded, already guessing the rest. She wanted to sell the house, but couldn't do that with a structural issue hanging over it. "I'll take a look," he said. His voice was low, rough from years of dust and cigarettes he no longer smoked. Shouldn't take long to figure out what's going on. Inside, the house smelled of dry wood, dust, and a faint trace of old cedar, the kind of scent that lingered when a home had stood too long untouched. The hallway stretched narrow between two rooms, its floorboards dark and worn. Daniel crouched and ran a hand along them. Cold. Unnaturally cold. Not the kind that came from drafts or poor insulation, but something that felt like the chill of stone buried deep beneath the ground. He unpacked his tools and began his inspection. The boards were newer than the rest of the flooring. Someone had replaced them not long ago, though they had been stained to match the rest of the house. The nails were clean, the edges fitted with a precision that didn't match the rest of the old craftsmanship. He found no obvious rot or moisture damage, no loose panels, yet when he pressed his palm against the wood again, the cold pulsed up into his skin. "You said your grandfather built this place?" Daniel asked. Maylin nodded from the doorway. He was a miner, worked most of his life down at the quarry before it shut down. He lived here until he died. Never let anyone touch this part of the floor. Said it was the foundation that held the house together. My mother used to laugh at that. Said it was just his way of being dramatic. Daniel looked up at her, studying her face. She didn't look like she believed the superstition, but something about the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other told him that the memory of her grandfather's warning still unsettled her. That night, after Maylin left him to lock up and finish his measurements, Daniel worked under the dim yellow light of a portable lamp. Outside, the sky had turned a deep blue, and the windows reflected his own movements, as though the house were quietly watching him. The air inside seemed thicker as the evening deepened. He marked the dimensions, checked the crawl space access, and listened to the hum of silence that lived in old walls. Then he heard it, a faint sound beneath him. Not loud, not even distinct, but something that made the hair at the back of his neck rise. It was like a soft shuffle, followed by stillness. He froze, listening. The noise didn't repeat. Maybe it was a rat, he thought. Maybe the boards were settling. Houses this old always breathed in strange ways. Still, when he stepped on that cold stretch of wood again, he could have sworn something shifted faintly below, as if exhaling. He packed up soon after, uneasy. The next morning, Malin brought coffee and paper cups and found him sitting on the porch steps, sketching a rough cross-section of the flooring in his notebook. She watched him a moment before saying, "You stayed late last night." "Yeah," he replied, setting the pencil down. "I thought I heard something under there." She looked past him toward the hallway. "You and me both. I used to hear creaks down there when I was a kid visiting my grandfather. I asked him what it was, and he said, 'It's just the house remembering.'" Daniel smiled faintly. "That's one way to put it." As he worked that day, he noticed more details that didn't add up. The soil under the foundation seemed compacted too tightly, as if someone had filled in a space long ago. There were faint discolorations on the boards, round patterns like something had pressed up from below. He took temperature readings again, same result. The cold spot hadn't changed, no matter how warm the rest of the house grew in the sun. Malin lingered nearby as he worked, telling him more about her grandfather. Howard Wood had been one of the last men to leave the mines when they shut down. His only son, Jason, had died in an accident there, an explosion that killed 6 men and closed the shaft forever. After that, the old man became reclusive. He boarded up the windows in the back rooms, stopped talking to neighbors, and would spend hours sitting by the hallway, his chair positioned exactly over that stretch of cold floor. He said everything worth keeping was already buried, Malin murmured, as though repeating something that had haunted her for years. When Daniel went back to his motel that evening, he couldn't shake the image of the chair standing over the cold boards, the old man's boots resting on a secret no one else could see. The following day, he began removing the floorboards. Malin had agreed, though reluctantly, giving him a nervous look as he pried up the first nail. Beneath the planks lay a layer of hardened soil and dust. He brushed it aside and tapped the surface with his hammer. Solid. But when he struck again, the sound changed. Hollow, distant, as though there were space beneath. He leaned closer, pressed his ear to the opening, and thought he heard something faint and irregular. A whisper, maybe. Or a sigh. He sat back quickly, heart hammering. By late afternoon, Malin had gone into town for supplies, leaving him alone again. The light slanted through the narrow hallway windows, and shadows pooled across the uneven floor. Daniel sat there staring at the gap he'd opened, unable to convince himself to dig deeper. He'd worked in hundreds of houses, patched rotted beams, rebuilt porches eaten through by termites, restored rooms that smelled of death and mildew. But this was different. This wasn't decay or damage. This was something intentional. When the sound came again, soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing toward, he froze. It was faint but distinct, rising from the earth beneath him. His throat went dry. He waited, barely daring to move. The noise stopped. A trick of acoustics, he told himself. An echo from the creek outside. But as the night wore on, and the air inside the house grew still and heavy, he could feel it again through his boots, the subtle tremor of life below the floor. He went outside to breathe. The stars had come out, thin and sharp in the cold sky. His breath clouded in front of him, though the air wasn't cold enough for that. He looked back at the windows of the house. In the glass, the light from his lamp flickered faintly, as if the house were winking at him. When he returned to his motel room, he couldn't sleep. The ticking of the clock on the wall became the steady pulse of that breathing sound in his memory. He thought about the way Malin had said her grandfather forbade anyone from touching the floor, and how he'd spent his last years guarding that one stretch of hallway. He imagined the old man sitting there, night after night, listening to the same sound Daniel had just heard. By dawn, he had made up his mind. Whether it was a hollow in the foundation, a forgotten storage space, or something else entirely, he had to see what was under there. He'd never been the kind of man to chase mysteries. His life was built on solving problems with nails and wood and logic. But this one had wrapped its fingers around his curiosity and wouldn't let go. He arrived back at the house before sunrise. The grass was wet with dew, the fog still low over the field behind the property. Inside, the boards in the hallway gleamed faintly under his flashlight. He crouched by the gap he'd opened, listening. Silence, the kind that pressed on the ears until it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. He rested his hand on the cold wood and whispered to himself, "Let's find out what you're hiding." And with that, Daniel Hayes began to uncover what lay beneath the floor that should never have existed. Dawn broke pale and heavy over the valley, light slipping across the ridges and settling on the damp grass that led to the woodhouse. Daniel arrived before sunrise, the air still cool enough to cloud his breath. His boots left dark impressions in the dew as he walked toward the porch, the old house looming ahead with its sagging roofline and silent windows. Inside, the faint smell of last night's dust and oil hung in the hallway, as if the air itself remembered what he had whispered before leaving, that he would find out what lay below. He stood over the section of floor he had uncovered the night before. The boards he had pried loose leaned against the wall, their undersides dark with soil. The exposed earth beneath looked undisturbed at first glance, but Daniel had been around enough strange sights to sense when something wasn't right. He crouched and brushed away a thin layer of dirt. Beneath it, he saw the outline of metal, the dull gleam of rusted iron. His heart picked up. He scraped carefully with a chisel until a grid of corroded bars appeared, a crude mesh welded by hand. Someone had gone to great effort to conceal whatever lay below. He fetched his crowbar, wedged it into the grid, and pried upward. The metal gave with a reluctant groan, releasing a slow breath of cold air that smelled of earth and rot. A faint draft whispered up through the opening, and the temperature dropped instantly around him. Daniel shivered. The hole was small, but he could see the edge of what looked like a wooden step descending into darkness. He switched on his flashlight and aimed it down. The beam caught the faint shape of a ladder. No, not a ladder, but stairs, narrow and uneven, carved crudely out of wood. They disappeared into the dark void beneath the house. For a long moment he stayed where he was, gripping the flashlight, his pulse thudding in his ears. He could fill it in now, tell the client the foundation had been compromised, charge her for the repairs, and be gone by tomorrow. But curiosity pressed at him harder than fear. He thought of the way Malin's grandfather had forbidden anyone to touch this place, the way the air in the hallway had always felt colder than the rest of the house. There was no logic to the way he felt, only the pull of something unseen, urging him to descend. He found a respirator in his bag, strapped it over his mouth, and lowered himself through the opening. The first step creaked under his weight. Dust cascaded from the beams above him, and with each careful movement, he felt the cold deepen until it gnawed at his bones. He moved slowly, one foot after another, the flashlight's beam trembling across the rough walls. The air smelled of mildew, old water, and something older still, the scent of long confinement. At the bottom, his boots met firm ground. He swept the light across the room. It was larger than he had expected, its low ceiling supported by wooden beams darkened with moisture. In one corner stood a rusted metal cot, half collapsed beneath the weight of time. Nearby lay a few empty jars, a broken chair, and what might have been a small table once. Cobwebs draped everything like a forgotten shroud. He turned slowly, letting the light trace the edges of the room, until it stopped on something that made him catch his breath. A sleeping bag lay in the far corner, newer than everything else. Next to it, a half-empty bottle of water. The plastic was clean, unstained by dust. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been here recently. Daniel took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he could see more clearly. Crumbs dotted the ground beside the sleeping bag. A crust of bread lay hardened in the dirt. Whoever this person was, they were surviving down here, not just hiding. He swung the light toward the walls. Faded writing appeared in places where the grime had been rubbed away, jagged letters carved into the wood. "Silence keeps me safe." He said not to come up. "Don't lift the floor." The words were layered over each other, etched with a knife or nail, uneven and frantic. Daniel's throat tightened. He crouched by the nearest wall and ran his fingers over the markings. The grooves were shallow but recent. The wood still splintered faintly under his touch. Something brushed against his arm. He spun, flashlight jerking wildly across the room. The beam flickered over an old photograph half buried in the dust. A young boy standing beside a man with coal-black hands, both smiling proudly in front of this very house. On the back, faint writing spelled two names, Jason and Dad. Daniel remembered Malin mentioning her uncle, the one who had died in the mine collapse. But if Jason had died, whose belongings were these? He turned again, aiming the flashlight deeper into the room. In the far wall, behind a collapsed shelf, there was a dark hollow, a tunnel mouth barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Its edges were smooth, as if worn by hands or repeated passage. The air that drifted from it was colder still, and carried with it a faint sound. At first, Daniel thought it was his imagination, the ringing in his ears from too much silence. But no, it was real. A slow, steady rhythm, not quite human, like someone breathing beneath layers of soil. He stumbled back toward the stairs, his flashlight trembling. His boot struck an old tin can, sending a sharp clang that echoed through the chamber. The breathing sound stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt alive, listening. He didn't remember climbing the stairs, only the rush of panic that propelled him upward until his hands were pushing the floorboard back into place. He stood in the hallway, panting, his palms slick with sweat despite the cold. The house around him was still, but it no longer felt empty. He went outside, gulping in the bright daylight, as though surfacing from deep water. The air was heavy with the scent of wet grass and the slow gurgle of the creek beyond the yard. For a long time, Daniel sat on the porch steps, trying to make sense of what he had seen. There was no logical explanation that fit. It was impossible, absurd. And yet he couldn't shake the image of that sleeping bag, the half-eaten bread, the words carved into the wall. When Malin returned later that afternoon, she found him sitting in the kitchen, pale and silent. He didn't speak until she asked what was wrong. Even then, he hesitated. "You said your grandfather was a miner," he began carefully. "You also said his son died in the collapse." "That's right," she said. "Jason. He was 23. Daniel nodded slowly. "And they found the body?" She blinked, confused. "No. There was a fire down there. They said it was too dangerous to recover what was left." "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the hallway where the loose boards waited, the faint smell of earth still seeping through the cracks. "Because I think someone's been living under your house," he said finally. Her face went white. "What?" "I found a room under there. A big one. Someone built it by hand, reinforced the beams. There's food, a sleeping bag, writing on the walls." She shook her head. "That's impossible. The foundation doesn't go that deep." "I saw it," Daniel said. "And I don't think it's old. Whoever was down there, they've been there recently." Malin stared at him, speechless, her eyes flicking toward the hallway. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "My grandfather used to say the house listened. I thought he was just losing his mind. Are you saying someone was down there all this time?" Daniel didn't know how to answer. He only knew that when he'd looked into that tunnel, he'd felt something. Not malice, exactly, but the heavy presence of another life pressed up against his own. That night, he stayed late again, long after Malin left. He couldn't bring himself to leave the mystery untouched. He set up his camera, a small motion sensor he used for site inspections, and pointed it toward the section of floor he'd uncovered. Then he sat by the kitchen table, listening. Hours passed. The wind moaned faintly through the trees outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then silence fell again. He was beginning to drift when he heard the faintest sound of wood shifting. His eyes snapped open. The motion sensor blinked red. Slowly, carefully, he turned toward the hallway. One of the boards had lifted, just slightly, enough for a sliver of shadow to move beneath it. Daniel stood, heart pounding. He wanted to speak, but fear rooted him where he was. Then, as suddenly as it had risen, the board settled back into place with a soft, almost apologetic thud. He didn't sleep that night. At dawn, he checked the camera footage. The motion sensor had triggered twice, but the video showed nothing, only the faint vibration of the floor and a small puff of dust rising as though the house had sighed. Later that morning, he told Malin he was leaving the equipment running for another day. She didn't protest. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed as though she hadn't slept either. "If there's someone down there," she said, "I don't want to know who. Some things, they're better left buried." Daniel didn't agree, though he said nothing. He had spent too many years patching over rot, rebuilding what others ignored. Every broken wall, every collapsed beam had a story. This one just happened to be buried under the floor. That evening, as rain began to fall against the windows, he took his flashlight and went back to the opening. The air felt different, heavier, charged with the storm outside. He lifted the boards again and peered down. The stairs waited, silent, patient, as if expecting his return. He descended more cautiously this time, the beam trembling over the same walls, the same scattered relics. The writing on the board seemed darker now, more frantic in the flickering light. He moved toward the far wall where he had seen the tunnel. The smell of damp earth filled his nose. Something glinted near the entrance. A tin cup, half buried in dirt. Beside it lay a folded scrap of cloth. He picked it up, brushing away the dust, and froze. It was a child's shirt, yellowed with age, but unmistakably real. The sound came again, from the darkness beyond the tunnel. Not breathing this time, but movement. Slow, dragging steps, like someone shuffling through mud. Daniel's throat tightened. He raised the flashlight, hand shaking, and whispered, "Who's there?" The noise stopped. Then, faintly, a voice answered, hoarse, barely audible, yet undeniably human. "Don't come down here." The beam quivered as Daniel backed away. His mind raced through possibilities. Intruder, vagrant, a sick man hiding from the world. But none of them explained the years of secrecy, the fresh traces among the dust. The voice had sounded old, cracked with disuse, but alive. He stumbled back toward the stairs, breathing hard. The shadows seemed to stretch around him, pressing closer. When he reached the opening and pulled himself up into the hallway, the light from his lamp looked almost blinding. He replaced the boards with trembling hands and stood staring at them for a long time. The house was utterly silent again, but that silence was no longer empty. It felt like a held breath, a pause between one heartbeat and the next. Daniel realized then that he had crossed a threshold. Whatever lay beneath that floor wasn't finished with him, and he could no longer pretend the cold was just a trick of bad insulation. When he finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low over the valley. The creek murmured softly, as if repeating something it had overheard from below. Daniel lit a cigarette he didn't want, and watched the smoke rise into the mist. He told himself he would come back tomorrow with someone else. Maybe the sheriff, maybe an inspector. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't. He had to face it alone. Whatever was down there wasn't just part of the house's foundation. It was the house itself, its secret, its wound, its heart. And beneath those boards, in that buried chamber, something was waiting. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that flattened everything it touched. Daniel sat in his truck outside the woodhouse, hands resting on the steering wheel, the engine still off. The night had left him hollow. He had barely slept, haunted by the echo of that voice, whispering up through the floorboards. Even now, as the sun crawled above the trees, he could still hear the words, "Don't come down here." It had not been a threat. It had been a plea, and that somehow made it worse. He stepped out of the truck, gravel crunching under his boots, and glanced toward the porch. The house seemed smaller in daylight, yet no less alive. Its windows caught the morning light without reflection, and the air around it felt denser than it should have been, like the earth itself was breathing. He forced himself forward. The boards under his feet groaned in recognition as he crossed the threshold and set down his tool bag. Malin was already there, sitting at the kitchen table. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her coffee untouched. When she looked up at him, there was no need for words. Both of them knew what he was about to do. "I heard it again last night," she said quietly. "After you left. I couldn't sleep, so I sat in the hallway. Around 3 in the morning, I felt something move, like the floor was breathing." Daniel nodded slowly. "It's not the wind. There's someone down there." She flinched at his certainty. "You're going back, aren't you?" "I have to. Whoever it is, they're not dangerous. They sounded tired, like they've been waiting for someone to listen." Malin wrapped her arms around herself. "If my grandfather knew, if he really hid someone down there, it means he lived his whole life with that secret. Maybe it's better not to know the rest." Daniel's voice softened. "Secrets rot just like wood, Malin. You can cover them up, but they'll eat through everything eventually." She looked away. "If you find something, promise me you won't call the police until we talk." He hesitated, then nodded. It wasn't that he intended to keep anything from the law, but this felt older than rules and jurisdiction. This was something human, something that had gone on too long to be handled by strangers with badges. He waited until afternoon, when the light coming through the windows was soft and even, before opening the floor again. The boards came up easily now, as if the house had grown used to the intrusion. He set up a lantern at the edge of the hole and breathed in the chill that drifted up from below. There was no sound this time. The silence pressed against his eardrums, thick and watchful. He lowered himself onto the first step, then the next. The wood creaked faintly, the air cooling with each descent. When his boots met the dirt floor, the lantern's glow stretched into the room, throwing shadows against the curved walls. Everything was as he had left it. The cot, the jars, the writing on the boards. But now, near the tunnel, a small square of paper lay on the ground. He approached slowly and picked it up. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. "Don't bring others. Please." Daniel's throat tightened. Whoever had written this knew he would come back. He turned toward the tunnel and said softly, "I'm alone." A long silence followed, then the faint scrape of movement. From the darkness, a figure began to emerge, slowly, hesitantly. The beam of his lantern found a face, hollow cheeks, tangled gray hair, a beard grown wild. The man's skin was so pale it almost glowed. His clothes were threadbare, his hands trembling as though the act of standing took all his strength. But his eyes, clouded, sunken, still held something alive. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice dry and cracked. "He told me never to speak to anyone." Daniel took a careful step forward. "Who told you that?" The man blinked, as if the question confused him. "The Old One. He said the world above forgot. Said it was safer down here." Daniel's heart pounded. "Howard Wood Malan's grandfather?" The man nodded once, weakly. "Howard. Good man. Brought food. Books. Told me they blamed me for the fire. Said I had to stay until it was over. But it never ended." "Did it?" Daniel knelt, lowering his voice. "The mine accident, was that you?" A flicker crossed the man's eyes, something like shame and exhaustion intertwined. "I was there. I tried to help. But when the walls came down, they said it was my fault. Howard pulled me out, told me the others were gone. Said the company would hang me for it if they knew I'd survived. So he made a room for me. Told me to wait until the truth came out." His hand trembled as he gestured to the walls. "He built this, kept me alive. Every few days he'd come down with bread, water, newspapers. Then one day he stopped coming. I thought maybe he'd died. I waited, but the door stayed closed. After that, I stopped counting the days." Daniel felt his throat tighten. The man's story fit too perfectly with the fragments Malan had told him. "How long have you been here?" The man smiled faintly, though the expression never reached his eyes. "I don't know. I stopped keeping track after the lights in the world above went out for good. I'd hear them sometimes, voices, cars, but I never went up. I'm not sure I could anymore. The dark, it changes you." Daniel wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck. He thought of all those years, the loneliness, the cold, the forgotten promises. "You don't have to stay down here anymore," he said quietly. "Howard's gone. The truth can come out now." The man shook his head. "No one wants the truth. They only want the story they can live with." "Maybe," Daniel said, "but you deserve a chance to live with yours." The man looked up then, eyes gleaming in the half-light. "What's your name?" "Daniel." "Daniel," he repeated, as if testing the sound after years of silence. "You fix things?" "I try." "Then fix this. Not for me. For him. He carried this secret until it broke him. He said I was part of the foundation. Maybe he was right." Daniel wanted to promise he would, but the weight of the man's gaze silenced him. He helped the stranger to his feet, surprised by how light he felt, how his bones seemed hollow beneath the skin. Together, they climbed the narrow stairs. When the man reached the top, he hesitated, blinking as though the dim light of the hallway was too much for his eyes. For a moment, Daniel feared he would retreat, but then he stepped forward, trembling hands gripping the edge of the opening. Malan was standing in the kitchen doorway. She froze when she saw him. For an instant, no one moved. The air between them seemed to vibrate with disbelief. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You're Jason." The man nodded slowly. "You look like your mother." She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "They said you were dead." "I was," he said simply. "Down there I was." Daniel watched as she approached, hesitant, then knelt beside him. She didn't touch him at first, only stared as though afraid he might vanish if she blinked. When she finally did reach out, her fingers brushed his sleeve, and he flinched as though from fire. "I didn't mean to frighten you," Jason murmured. "Your grandfather wanted to protect us both. He thought he could fix what the world broke. Maybe he did, for a while. Malin looked at Daniel, her face pale and wet. "We have to call someone. He needs help." Jason's voice sharpened. "No police. Please." "Not yet." Daniel raised his hands gently. "It's all right. We won't. But you need food. Rest. You can't stay here like this." Jason's eyes darted toward the window, where the first sliver of sunlight fell across the floorboards. "I can't go outside. Not yet. It's too bright." So Daniel helped him to a chair, found a blanket, and poured him water. Jason drank slowly, his hands shaking. Each swallow seemed to cost him effort. He looked around the kitchen as though it were a cathedral. "I used to sit right there," he said, nodding toward the far corner. "Mother would bring me milk and bread. Howard would come in smelling of coal and dirt. We were poor, but the light back then, it was clean. Do you know what I mean?" Neither of them answered. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall filled the silence. As the hours passed, Jason spoke more, his words wandering through years of memory. He told them about the explosion in the mine, how the company had ignored warnings about weak supports, how he had tried to save his team when the tunnel collapsed. He had woken in the dark with broken ribs and blood in his mouth, Howard dragging him out through a service shaft. Afterward, Howard had sworn him to silence. The company paid the family's hush money and blamed Jason for the deaths. He had agreed to disappear, thinking it would be temporary. But temporary things have a way of lasting forever, he said bitterly. When he grew too tired to speak, Daniel and Malin sat in silence, absorbing the enormity of it. The light outside faded, the room turning to gold, then gray. Jason sat hunched under the blanket, eyes half closed. That night, Daniel drove to town and spoke to a retired journalist he knew, a man who had once written about the mining disaster. The old reporter listened quietly as Daniel told him everything. When he was done, the man said, "If this is true, you're sitting on a story that'll rewrite this town's history." Daniel didn't care about that. He just wanted the truth out. Not for fame, but for peace. For Howard. For Jason. 2 days later, the story broke. The old records were re-examined, the company's negligence exposed. Jason's name was cleared. By the time officials arrived at the Woodhouse, he was sitting on the porch with Malin, wrapped in the same blanket, watching the light shift through the trees. He looked older than before, but calmer, as if a lifetime of shadows had finally loosened their grip. When they took him to a hospital, he didn't resist. He only turned to Daniel and said, "You fixed it." After Jason was gone, Daniel stayed behind to finish what he had started. He repaired the floor, replaced the boards, and sealed the hole, not to bury the truth, but to honor it. Before he laid the last plank, he placed a small wooden cross beneath, carved with the words, "Howard once spoke. The foundation holds." When the house was sold weeks later, Malin insisted Daniel take one of her grandfather's old tools as payment, a hammer worn smooth from years of use. He kept it in his truck, a quiet reminder of the man who had built both a home and a secret beneath it. On his last day in the valley, Daniel stood by the creek, listening to the water move over stones. The wind carried the scent of damp soil and pine, and for the first time in months, he felt the weight of silence lift. The house behind him was empty now, but he knew it wasn't lonely. Its secret had been set free. He looked back once, saw the porch bathed in the pale light of dawn, and smiled. Then he got in his truck, started the engine, and drove away, leaving behind the house with the cold floor and the man who had finally stepped out from under it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch more of our stories right here on the channel. There's always another secret waiting to be uncovered. And if you liked this video, share it with your friends. It really helps the channel grow.